Welcome to our deep dive, and today we're really going deep into the world of habeas corpus. Yeah, I know what you might be thinking, legal history, but trust me on this one. This isn't some boring law school lecture. We're going to uncover how this centuries-old legal thing has actually shaped the fight for freedom. I mean, we're talking surprising cases, twists and turns you won't believe.
It's wild how often we get caught up in the name itself, habeas corpus. The real power, though, it all comes down to its function. It's this ability, you see, to hold those in power, to hold their feet to the fire and make them explain why they're holding someone against their will.
And we've got a ton of sources to get through today. Legal journals, court judgments, historical legislation, you name it, we've got it. But what's the mission here? I guess it's to understand how something that seems so simple, this writ, has managed to adapt and survive as this safeguard of liberty.
And a key to understanding that, I think, is realizing that it wasn't always called habeas corpus. Especially in early America. I mean, people back then used a whole bunch of legal maneuvers to try and get the same result, getting released from unlawful imprisonment.
So different tools for the same job. What's an example of that?
Oh, there's a great one. The case of Zipporah, free black woman, 1662, Massachusetts. She was accused of infanticide and jailed without bond. Zipporah, though, she successfully argued for release based on that lack of bond, highlighting this core principle. You have to justify why you're detaining someone, even way back then. I think it speaks to a bigger theme of due process, one that's still relevant today, especially for marginalized communities who haven't always been treated fairly by the law.
It's incredible to see how things connect through history like that. But let's rewind a bit. Yeah, let's talk about the common law roots of all this. What was it about this system that allowed something like habeas corpus to even exist?
Common law, it was all about speed and pragmatism. It really put emphasis on cutting through all the legal jargon and getting to the heart of the issue. Was this detention lawful or not? It wasn't about getting lost in the weeds. It was about making sure that justice was served quickly.
So, cut to the chase. Was this a legal arrest or what?
Exactly. There's this case, Edward Whitmore, 1771, New Hampshire. He was caught up in a mess of debt laws. But when his case finally made it to court, they basically just swept those complexities aside. Their primary concern was his imprisonment lawful in the first place?
They were laser focused on that core issue of liberty.
So is it fair to say that habeas corpus is basically like a get-out-of-jail-free card?
That is a common misconception, actually. It's important to understand that habeas corpus only challenges if the detention was legal, not whether the person is actually guilty or not.
Okay, so even if you might be guilty, you still have the right to be detained lawfully.
Exactly. And a really good example of this is the case of Dr. Barnardo. He was accused of taking children from their parents under the pretense of charity. And regardless of what people thought of him or the charges, the court still investigated the claims that he was detaining these children illegally, meticulously, I might add.
Due process, even for the controversial figures. But things get even more complicated when you bring in executive power, right? Oh, absolutely. That tension, that push and pull between individual liberty and state power, especially in times of crisis, that's always been a major factor in how habeas corpus is interpreted and used.
So it's not just about the laws it's written, it's about how it actually plays out in the real world.
Exactly. And there's no better example than the case of John Merriman during the Civil War. Detained by military order, his case actually led Chief Justice Taney to challenge President Lincoln directly over Lincoln suspending habeas corpus. And can you imagine? It triggered this massive debate about just how far executive power can go, even during a war.
That's incredible. A true showdown for the history books. But we've been talking a lot about American examples here. Was this just a Western legal idea?
Not at all. The case of Chief Sagoma in early 20th century Bechuanaland, now Botswana, really shows that. He was exiled by British authorities, and his case sparked all these legal battles that really highlighted how far this principle reached. I mean, we're talking across continents.
Exiled chief, the British Empire, legal battles. This has to be a good story. Tell me more.
So at first, the courts, they were really hesitant to get involved in colonial affairs, stepping on toes and all that. But as Sagoma's case went on, there's a noticeable shift in their thinking. They moved from a narrow focus on just the procedure to a much broader understanding of the rule of law, even in a colonial setting.
We're seeing this evolution of thought playing out on a global scale. But what about habeas corpus today? With everything going on, terrorism, all the new technology, has it become irrelevant?
That's where it really gets interesting. Instead of fading away, habeas corpus has actually adapted. It's still incredibly relevant. Just the battleground has shifted, you see. Take Guantanamo Bay, for example. The detention of unlawful combatants there. It raised these unprecedented questions about habeas corpus, about how far it actually reaches, can it extend beyond U.S. soil, and if it can, what rights do those detainees have?
Those are some heavy questions. And you know there are strong opinions about it on all sides.
Absolutely, and it's not just about where habeas corpus applies, it's also about how it's used. The Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, AEDPA, from 1996, that significantly changed habeas corpus, especially for people on death row.
AEDPA 1996. Sounds important, but for those of us who aren't legal experts, why should we care about this particular act?
Well, in a nutshell, AEDPA made it much harder to file for habeas corpus, especially for death row inmates. They basically emphasized that federal courts should defer to the decisions of state courts, more hoops to jump through, and a much tougher burden of proof for anyone trying to get their sentence overturned.
More roadblocks on the path to a second chance. Makes you think. In today's world with all its complexities, can a centuries-old legal tool really protect our individual liberty?
That's the question, isn't it? But before we go further into how habeas corpus is being challenged today, we really need to understand AEDPA and its impact on the legal world.
And we'll do just that right after the break. So we're back, and before the break we were talking about AEDPA, this 1996 act that really changed the game for habeas corpus, especially for those on death row.
Yeah. AEDPA's impact was huge. It brought in a stricter time limit for filing habeas petitions, limited when federal courts could review state court decisions, and made the burden of proof much heavier for petitioners trying to prove their claims.
So it's almost like they were stacking the deck against anyone hoping to use habeas corpus for another shot at justice.
You could say that. It was part of a larger trend, really. This push to make habeas corpus harder to use, especially in death penalty cases. There were concerns about too many appeals clogging up the courts, and this desire to, well, speed up the execution process.
So it's about making sentencing more final. But at what cost?
That's the debate, right? On the one hand, you want justice to be swift and final, but on the other, if you limit habeas corpus too much, you risk executing someone who didn't get a fair trial in the first place.
And those flaws, when it comes to the death penalty, those have some pretty irreversible consequences.
Exactly. That's why AEDPA is still such a hot topic. As is habeas corpus in general, it gets at the heart of our values as a society, our belief in fairness, in due process, in the sanctity of life itself.
You mentioned this trend of restricting habeas corpus, and we've been focusing on the U.S., but what about how it's used in other countries?
You know, that's a great question, because it reminds us that habeas corpus isn't just an American thing. These principles, they're relevant globally, but how it's used, that changes. Depends on the legal and political situation.
So, same principle, different playing field. Got an example?
Oh, absolutely. Let's go back to the 1920s, the UK. We've got this fascinating case, Art O'Brien. He was an Irish Republican living in London. And his story, it shows how messy things get when you mix political turmoil with the fight for individual liberty.
Set the scene for us. Who was Art O'Brien, and how did he end up in this legal battle?
So O'Brien, he was a big name in the Irish Republican movement. When the Irish Civil War broke out, he sided with the anti-treaty faction. The British government, they were worried about more unrest, so they decided to arrest a whole bunch of these supporters, over 100 of them, including O'Brien, and they wanted to transfer them to the newly formed Irish Free State.
Deportation without a trial. Sounds like a habeas corpus case waiting to happen.
You got it. O'Brien's detention was challenged, both in Irish and English courts. It brought up these complicated questions about jurisdiction, and if it was even legal to detain someone like that after such a huge political event.
It's like a legal tug-of-war, with someone's freedom hanging in the balance.
Yeah.
So what were the main arguments on each side?
The big question was whether the British government still had the power to detain people and send them to Ireland. Even after the Irish Free State was established, the British government, their argument was that emergency regulations from the Irish Rebellion were still in effect, so they were justified.
And O'Brien's lawyers, what was their counter?
They said those emergency regulations were outdated, that the new Irish Free State, with its own laws, took precedence. Basically, a new nation was born, and the old rules didn't apply anymore.
What a legal pickle. So who won? Did habeas corpus save the day for Art O'Brien?
This is where it gets even more interesting, more twists and turns than you can shake a stick at. So the Irish courts, they initially said no to habeas corpus, but then they decided to hold off. See what happened with the legal fight going on in England? Meanwhile, over in England, the case was bouncing between courts. The King's Bench Division, they initially ruled against O'Brien, but then the Court of Appeal, they overturned that decision. It was a landmark judgment.
Sounds like things were heating up across the pond. What was the reasoning behind the Court of Appeals decision?
They basically said, look, habeas corpus is crucial. It protects against unlawful detention. Even during times of political upheaval, you can't just ignore the rule of law, even in a crisis.
Victory for O'Brien.
Yeah.
And a win for habeas corpus. So that's it, right? Case closed.
Not so fast. The British government, they weren't giving up that easily. They appealed to the highest court in the land, the House of Lords. And in a surprising twist, the House of Lords sided with the government. They said those emergency regulations were still valid. Big blow to O'Brien's hopes for freedom.
Oh, man. After all that, back to square one.
It seemed that way, yeah. But even though the courts ruled against him, O'Brien's case had sparked this huge controversy. Public opinion, especially within the Labour Party, they were really critical of the government. They saw it as a major abuse of power.
So the fight moved from the courtroom to the court of public opinion.
Exactly. And that's what's so powerful about legal battles like this. They don't just stay within the walls of the courtroom. All the pressure from the public, from the opposition, it forced the government to reconsider what they were doing.
So what happened? Did O'Brien ever get his freedom?
He did. All that pressure, it made the government back down. They ordered his release. O'Brien's case shows how powerful legal challenges can be, especially when they get people fired up. When they're combined with public pressure and political activism, that's how you protect individual rights.
It's not always about what a judge decides. It's about the bigger conversation these cases start.
You said it, the O'Brien case. It reminds us that fighting for individual liberty, it's not just about courtrooms, it takes a multifaceted approach. The legal system, public opinion, political pressure. It's about holding those in power accountable to principles of justice and fairness.
And speaking of holding leaders accountable, let's bring it back to the U.S. for a second. Back to John Merriman and his case. A direct clash between the judiciary and the executive branch over habeas corpus, all during a national crisis.
The Merriman case. It's a pivotal moment in the history of habeas corpus in America. It highlights that tension between individual rights and national security, a theme that's still relevant today, especially in the war on terror.
Different time period, same basic issues. Seems like finding that balance between liberty and security, especially in a crisis, that's something we're always grappling with.
You got it. And when we come back, we're going to explore the very question. In the context of Guantanamo Bay, that's where the battle over habeas corpus went international, raising even bigger questions about how far American law can reach, and about the rights of detainees facing new and evolving threats to national security.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be diving into those complex and challenging issues right after this.
Here.
You're back. And we're turning our attention now to Guantanamo Bay, a place that's become, well, synonymous with the war on terror, but it's also a place where this fight over habeas corpus, it's really taken center stage.
Yeah, Guantanamo, it's a real challenge to the idea of habeas corpus, this legal gray area. You know, physically, it's not the U.S., but it's under U.S. control. So then you have these questions about how far American law can actually reach and what rights detainees held there actually have.
A legal and ethical maze, to say the least.
Yeah.
So how did courts even begin to make sense of Guantanamo?
The legal battles over Guantanamo, let me tell you, they've been incredibly complex and controversial. At first, the Bush administration, they argued that since these detainees were enemy combatants, and since they weren't on U.S. soil, well, they weren't entitled to the same protections as, say, U.S. citizens, or even people detained within the U.S.
So they were trying to use location as a loophole. Did that work?
It led to years of legal back and forth, appeals on top of appeals. Eventually, the Supreme Court, they had to step in. It was Boumediene v. Bush, landmark case. And in a 5-4 decision, they said that Guantanamo detainees, they do have the right to challenge their detention in federal court under habeas corpus.
It's huge. A big win for those fighting for the detainees' rights. Did that finally settle things?
It's not that simple. Boumediene was important, sure. It said that detainees have a right to habeas corpus, but it didn't solve everything. There were still questions about the conditions they were being held in, the evidence used against them, the procedures for their trials, and those questions, they're still being debated today.
It sounds like Guantanamo, it's become this focal point, the central point in a much larger debate. National security versus individual rights.
Oh, yeah.
In the age of terrorism.
Exactly. The Guantanamo cases. They force us to ask some really tough questions. How do we keep our country safe from threats, real or perceived, while still staying true to the ideas of justice and due process? How do we balance our need for security with individual rights, even if those individuals are accused of being our enemies?
Not easy questions to answer. And with technology changing so rapidly, It seems like those challenges to habeas corpus, they're only going to get more complicated. I mean, think about it. Mass surveillance,
Yeah.
artificial intelligence, data collection on a scale we've never seen before.
It's true, the digital revolution. It's brought a whole new set of challenges to individual liberty, challenges that the people who created habeas corpus, they could have never imagined. I mean, governments, corporations, they can track where we go, what we say, what we do online. They're collecting mountains of data about our lives.
It's almost like we need to rethink what deprivation of liberty even means in this digital age. It's not just about being locked up anymore, is it? It's about how our digital lives are being watched, manipulated, controlled.
That's exactly it. And that's what we're grappling with now. Can this legal tool, created centuries ago to deal with physical imprisonment, can it deal with these subtler ways our freedoms are being restricted today in the digital world? Can habeas corpus evolve to protect not just our physical liberty, but our digital liberty too?
So what does habeas corpus look like in the digital age? Is it about taking the government to court over surveillance programs? Is it about fighting for our privacy when corporations are collecting all this data on us?
Those are the questions, aren't they? And legal experts are trying to figure them out right now. There are no easy answers. But one thing's for sure. As technology keeps advancing, we have to change how we think about liberty and the laws we use to protect it.
It makes you wonder, looking back from, say, 100 years in the future, how will we judge this moment in time? Will we be able to say that we met these challenges head on? That we adapted our laws, our institutions to protect individual liberty in the face of all these new threats?
That's the question, isn't it? But I'm optimistic. I think that by tackling these tough questions, by being honest about the choices we have to make, and by never backing down from those core principles of justice and fairness, we can navigate this digital age. And we can preserve the freedoms that define us.
It's a call to action, really, for all of us. Be informed, be engaged, hold our leaders accountable, and demand that our laws, our technology reflect our values.
Couldn't agree more. The fight for liberty, it never ends. It's a journey. And habeas corpus, sure, it's centuries old. But that core principle, no one should be deprived of their liberty without just cause. That's as relevant and important today as it ever was.
This has been a deep dive, that's for sure, into the world of habeas corpus. And we hope that this journey through history, through legal battles, through all these challenges, has given you a better understanding of this vital legal tool and how important it still is in the fight for individual liberty.
Remember, the fight goes on. Stay curious, stay engaged, keep asking the tough questions.
Thanks for joining us.